There really are only a few key extensions of the counterterrorism policy that W does. So you guys watch that whole video, and granted, it's hard to sort of make some general conclusions from that video other than trying to figure out who was at the table, why, what were they saying, etc. So we're going to try. I'm going to try and summarize it a little bit better here, just sort of the main pieces. So we have the extensions, and there's really three big extensions. Number one is going to be that there's some new enemies, and what I mean extensions, I mean extensions from pre 9/11 counterterrorism policy. So one is going to be there's new enemies on the table. As you saw in the video, they're not really new enemies; they're just now enemy number one type thing. The second thing we're going to talk about is this idea called the Bush Doctrine, and what that is. And then the last thing we want to talk about is some sort of late extensions, sort of after Iraq, that become sort of, by the end of W's presidency, these are kind of the set in stone type things. Okay, so the first set of new enemies we want to talk about are Islamic radical organizations. And what we start to realize very quickly, again, if you're in the CIA or State Department and you're studying these things very intricately before 9/11, you already know these things exist. But honestly, people outside those rooms didn't care that much, and so it wasn't sort of common knowledge. So this is something that first the State Department and Defense Department learned about, and then politicians learned about, and then the rest of us sort of learned about how this works. And that there's this network. There's a network that exists that helps these Islamic radical organizations, whatever they might be. They might not even agree on their policies. Honestly, they might not even be Islamic to some degree. But they don't necessarily agree on what they want to do, but they agree on how they want to go about doing it. And the process of using terror to achieve your goals is a thing that becomes almost like something you have to not really go to school to learn, but you sort of have to be mentored in, apprenticed in. And so a network exists, and it has existed for a long time, but we start to get a better idea for what this looks like. So, for example, Taliban and Al-Qaeda, they weren't buddies, they didn't hang out. They were affiliated, but not allied. I don't know that I can come up with a great definition as to this distinction there. They did some things together, they talked to each other, but it's not like, they were super good buddies. And this is kind of what we see, and I'll show you this here in a second. Well, let me just show you right now. Let me go back. Okay, so here is just, when was this? 2000, must have been 2011. So again, after about a decade, what have we learned about these organizations? And this is a good starting point. It shows you the complexity of the whole thing. It does sort of imagine that, like, for example, these groups are separate from these groups, and that's not always true. There were still some links. But again, what one of those lines between one of these things means, it doesn't mean that they were super good buddies. It just means that there was communication between this organization, small enough that it really doesn't make it on there, and say Al-Qaeda Central. And that these were sort of all interconnected with each other. If there was someone maybe in this organization here who's really good at building IEDs, then maybe this organization over here might talk to this organization, who might talk to this organization and help get that information here, and then they are better at building those IEDs. Just, again, that's what we sort of mean by affiliated. It wasn't that they were working together in some sort of general global conspiracy or that they had meetings or anything like that. It was just that maybe somebody in this organization knows a few people in this organization. And that was enough of a connection that you could sort of trade ideas, learn from each other, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there was some movement of people between these things, but there's not much movement of people. It's mostly movement of ideas, sometimes money and goods. So that takes us, here's what that means, is if you harm the network, that's going to be what harms the organizations. So, and if you just go back to that, I should have done this when I had that up there, but if you take out Osama bin Laden, for example, have you stopped global terrorism? The answer is obviously no. You haven't really even stopped Al-Qaeda. You just made the network rearranged. In the same way that if you go on the internet and a particular website goes down, the internet doesn't crash. You just get redirected through other things to the sites you want to get to. Same thing here. So if you can actually not just harm the nodes, they call those things, these are the nodes. That's a node, that's a node. Rather than harming the nodes, if you could harm the network itself, it could actually sort of be counterterrorism. And that becomes sort of the direction that we go with this. It's not, I mean, there are going to be sort of those quick short-term victories where a drone strike's going to take somebody out. Hooray. That doesn't change the network at all. The network still keeps going on. The main part of counterterrorism is going to be harming that network. So U.S. efforts then, if this is true, then it's not just where Al-Qaeda is or where Osama bin Laden is. Remember, the old version is there's an attack, so we send a cruise missile strike back at that organization, done. That's not how this works anymore. If the thing exists by a network, then the U.S. counterterrorism efforts have to be everywhere that such a groups exist. And if you saw that last thing, it was everywhere. Now, the main target's still going to be training camps. Why do you think training camps are going to be our main target? The answer is because if there's one thing the military can do, the military can hit geographic targets. The military has a much harder time hitting individuals. If you want me to take out that factory, I know where the factory is. I can check it out from the satellite, and I can hit that target with a bomb. If it's an individual, that's a much more difficult thing for the military to do. The military has to learn how to do this over time. It does not start off in 2001 saying, yeah, I can go get that guy. Even the CIA is having trouble with that because the CIA had been reduced in terms of its human intelligence, knowing where people were. Online, where we see these efforts online, it's really less clear how to do this. I got to be honest with you, even today, U.S. counterterrorism, I should say global counterterrorism online is not that great. Probably better than it was, but it's just not that great. So this means that the war on terror, or if we say the war on Al-Qaeda, so let's start here. The war on Al-Qaeda, well, Al-Qaeda is part of this network. So we're just going to say, instead of war on Al-Qaeda, we're going to say the war on terror. Where does the war on terror happen? Anywhere these guys are, which means everywhere. So you get the global war on terror. Now we've got sort of how this is going to be fought. Each state has a responsibility to act as well in this. So every state in the world, from the U.S. position, every state in the world has a responsibility to stop terrorism where it's happening. So here's the old way of talking about this. The old way of talking about this is states were forbidden, I guess you could say, from actively aiding terrorist organizations. Now, if there was a terrorist organization in your country, like those training camps we were talking about in that last one, the training camps, let's say there's a training camp in the deserts of Tunisia. Well, you know what? No one's going to blame Tunisia for the fact that there's a terrorist camp operating in their territory. As long as they're not actively aiding that organization, like if they ignore it, that's fine. But if they actively aid it, that's going to be a problem. But if it just exists there, that's one thing. But now after 9/11, that is no longer the case. Now the state can't passively ignore terrorist organizations in their territory. If Tunisia is allowing a terrorist camp to operate in their territory, then Tunisia is considered now a state sponsor of terrorism. And it now is as much in the sights as Al-Qaeda is. And that's a big change in terms of foreign policy. Bush's whole position on this is U.S. has the right to act if they can't or won't. If Tunisia says, well, I don't really feel like it's our responsibility, I don't think we're going to do anything about that camp, that's essentially Tunisia saying, giving up its rights to sovereignty. And so when the U.S. blows that camp up, it's actually not violating Tunisian sovereignty because Tunisia was supposed to do this. What if Tunisia doesn't have the ability to do that? Well, even more so, the United States will step in and do this. Let's talk about the sort of theory here. State sovereignty carries certain obligations. And from the U.S. position, one of those key obligations is that the state will not passively ignore terrorist organizations in their territory. If you, as a state, do not fulfill your obligations, your sovereignty is in question. If Tunisia just turns a blind eye to that terrorist camp operating in their territory, they have failed to fulfill their obligations and their sovereignty is in question. Therefore, if the United States bombs that terrorist camp, have they violated Tunisia's sovereignty? The answer is no, because their sovereignty is in question. So no violation of sovereignty to bomb terrorists. This is using the very same logic as you might know from other classes, the responsibility to protect movement, which deals more with humanitarian issues than with terrorist issues, but it's the same principle, and this is going to be the thing that is used by the United States for a long time to essentially do drone strikes, to do special ops missions, to bomb places, to bomb terrorist organizations, terrorist capabilities in other countries, whether that country is okay with that or not. All right, take a look at the next video and we'll come back.